Too hot. Hello, lovely people of the internet, and welcome to episode 5 of the NovelTea Knitting Podcast. I am your host, Emma, here to talk to you about all things knitting, bookish, basically anything cozy that takes my fancy. Before we get started today, I have a bit of an announcement. I'm publishing a pattern! So I've been talking about this for probably all 5 episodes because I have been either actively working on this or it has been in the process of being test knit by my amazing knitting club members. This is my Falling Leaves pattern. The pattern itself is mostly this leaf motif, but of course it does come with detailed instructions for the heel flap and gusset and a wedge toe as well. Of course, you can always do whatever heel and toe you like. This yarn is AJHC Wools in their conveniently named Falling Leaves colorway. That was 100% a coincidence. I was trying to make a fall-themed pattern, and this was the yarn that I was planning to use for that. But I named the pattern before I realized that the yarn also was called Falling Leaves. The pattern will, of course, be available in English. There will be 2 versions of it. One version will be full of lots of pictures, images, in particular, some images to detail how you do this leaf motif. And then there will also be a printer-friendly version, which has been requested by one of the members of my knitting club, and I thought was just a brilliant idea. So I reformatted the pattern so that there's a version of it that doesn't have any pictures in it, so it's really easy to print. The pattern will be available the day that this episode comes out, so April 30th, and it will be $5, but if you use the code NTKPodcast, it will be 20% off. Just my little thank you to everyone who comes and joins in these episodes and subscribes. I really hope that you guys love this pattern as much as I have loved making it. Moving on, for anyone that is joining us for the very first time, this podcast comes to you in 2 parts. The first part is primarily knitting content, but it can be knitting, crochet, basically anything crafty. The second part is just all books. It's mostly what I'm reading and what I finished, but everything is timestamped in the description down below, so you can jump around to your heart's content. If you are only here for the book content, you can jump onto that. If you're only here because you want to see my whips, well, stick around. So, grab a cup of tea, and let's get started. First and foremost, at least in my opinion, I have finished my falling rain socks. These ended up taking me a lot longer than I expected just because of the complications that come with turning a pattern inside out, but wanting the bottom to be in regular stockinette. Not to mention trying to do a heel flap and gusset on a reverse stockinette sock. I did have a much easier time knitting my second one. I know that they probably look identical to you, so who cares which one is my second one? But I care, actually, because this one, my first one, it has this here along the edge of the heel flap, which I wasn't very keen on, and it had this hole here. This one had holes quite badly where I connected for the heel flap. And this one isn't great in terms of the holes at the heel flap. There's still a little one here, but this side doesn't have one, and the laddering is definitely not as bad. And thanks to a viewer who commented on my podcast when I was talking about the laddering problem that I was having, they recommended that I knit 2 through the back loop instead of doing a slip-slip knit, and I don't know if they realized that it was going to be immensely helpful when it came to these socks, but it was! So thank you very much to that person. I cannot remember their username at the moment, so I will put it up in this void somewhere. But it really helped with my laddering and with the holes that I get, and it helped get rid of this little effect. You can see here when I was doing my gusset decreases that it created kind of a weird spiral. If it will stay focused long enough for you to see it, maybe. You can see that it's kind of more of a spiral almost than like a nice flat decrease. Let me show you this in comparison because it'll be very obvious once you can see this one. You can see that it's just some very nice even stockinette here, whereas it was those twisted rows on the other one, and that was from the Slip Slip Purling. So I'm very pleased about that. I also picked up the heel flap slightly differently so that there wasn't quite as much of a gap. So it just means that this along the edge of my heel flaps looks like this very neat stockinette stitch, as opposed to, once again, this slightly like twisted looking stitch on this side. So as I said in the last episode, the easy part has definitely been writing up the pattern for this motif, and the hard part has been writing up the instructions for the heel flap and gusset and for the foot. And I made it significantly harder on myself by doing these socks inside out, but yay for the experience, I suppose. This pattern I'm hoping to have out in a couple of weeks, but it's going to take a lot of troubleshooting, and I think I'm going to have to knit them up again. In the meantime, I do have another pattern that I have just worked up that I think is going to be easier to write up than this one, so stay tuned for that. I will talk about that a little bit more in my whips segment. Next up, I have for you some swatches. I know that under normal circumstances, a swatch would be considered like just barely starting a project, much less actually like being a finished object themselves. But guys, I really need a win with this Schnee sweater, so I'm calling them finished objects. This swatch is on a US 9, while this one is on a US 8, and I actually just finished this swatch this morning, so it is still damp. I have to wait for this one to dry still before I really know what I'm going to do, but I'm leaning towards the 8 rather than the 9. I like the drape of the fabric with the 9, but I'm not super sure if I'm going to like the appearance of the pattern, especially on a cardigan which is going to be quite heavy in itself. So I don't want the weight of that to be pulling on these stitches because I don't think that I would like this pattern when it's pulled like that. Although, I don't know, that looks kind of cool. I kind of like that. So maybe I will go with the 9. Again, I have to wait until this one is dried and off of the blocking mat, and I can actually like kind of weigh them. Obviously, this one is quite a bit bigger than the other one, and that is not just because I used a bigger needle. It's because this is the yarn from the very first swatch that I ever did, and that one, even though it was completely useless, apparently it was massive. Anyway, I also have a half object for you guys today, which is 1/2 of my Christmassy socks. You know, I call them Christmassy socks, but technically this colorway is called garden. A garden is definitely not what I think of when I think of Christmas necessarily, but this pattern looks very Christmassy. The yarn at the toe and the cuff is slightly more green than what it looks like. Maybe that's part of the problem, is that the green is very much like a sprucey, like bluey green, but I don't care what you say. You can call the yarn whatever you want. It looks like a Christmas sock to me, and that is all that matters. I have not cast on the next one yet, but I'm going to be doing that very soon. I really, really, really love this. It was such an easy knit, and the fact that the pattern is just slightly different all the way down practically made it so easy to just keep going and going and going because I wanted to see what it would be next. I did end up having to do a little bit of modification just because I really prefer a 6-inch leg. The pattern clearly was going to keep going for longer than that, and so I did just pull out the rest of the pattern so that I could get to this blocky bit for the heel. I'm glad I noticed actually in the picture on the tag for this yarn that the heel had this blocked out color section, because if I hadn't, I wouldn't have known to do this, and then I would have had just super randomly a big old chunk of this blue-green in the middle of my foot. So yeah, that's a slightly inconvenient thing about these socks, but in my opinion, well worth it, because they're just so pretty. I also pulled out a whole bunch of this yarn. after I finished the toe so that I could get to this next yellow stripe. Under all of this weird yellow color is the dark blue color that I'm going to be starting my heel with. Speaking of which, actually, I cast these on wrong. I should have read the instructions first and actually listened to the instructions because it tells you to pull from the center, but there was the big yellow chunk on the outside, and so I was like, oh, I'll just pull the yellow from the outside, and it turns out that it is just a huge pool of this blue-green. It's meant to be just for the toe and then like extra yarn, I suppose, probably, because, I mean, most people are not going to use a full 100-gram skein of yarn for a pair of socks, but you need the extra yarn there, you know, just in case. So I was knitting and knitting and knitting and knitting, and I must have gotten to like here at least, and it was still this blue-green color, and I was like, I'm pretty sure that's wrong. So I ended up pulling all of it out. All of this that I rewrapped here was stuff that I had knit, and I put it back on the skein, and I pulled out from the center like I was supposed to in the first place. This is why we read instructions. The one thing that I am not looking forward to in these socks is the absolute yarn barf that is going to happen as soon as I start like really getting out that middle bit, especially after having taken out all of this already. It's gonna be just that much worse because I have all of this on the outside. I guess I could pull it all out and get a cake started, but that seems like a lot of work. And granted, pulling apart yarn barf knots is also a lot of work, but it is work for me for later. So I'm probably going to do that. But this is it for my finished objects, so we will move right along into works in progress. I know that I told you guys in a previous episode that I was setting this yarn aside to put into my morning cup sweater, which of course I had not cast on yet. I still have not cast on. And now it will probably be even longer before I cast on because this yarn is going to be socks. This yarn is going to be my falling snow socks. I just thought that the color seemed really good. I didn't want to do like a white, but I also didn't want to do anything self-striping or micro-striping or anything like that. I think these socks are going to look the best on something that is lighter colored, on something that is tonal or speckled rather than striped. And this yarn honestly fits the bill so perfectly. As a reminder, the yarn is called Kicksand. It is by Adelaide Fiber Co. And I was a little bit hesitant to use this not only because it was technically supposed to be for another project now, but also because the name is not very wintry. Kicksand makes me think beaches. That being said, I think that this is going to be just too perfect for these socks not to use it. That being said, there are two main reasons that I decided to go with this yarn. The first one is that I really, really love this cream color for the pattern that I have in mind. It has some very subtle tonal differences throughout the yarn, which I don't even know if you're going to be able to see it on the camera. And I just think it's going to be absolutely lovely and very delicate. The other reason is that I am trying my absolute hardest right now to go stash diving for all of my projects. I really don't need to buy more yarn right now. I just got that huge haul of gifted yarn. I have more than enough already taking up space in my stash, and I am just trying to save a little bit of money right now. Actually, that leads me onto a tangent, so let me set this down for a minute, because I have to tell you about my advent calendar. So as returning viewers will know, I absolutely love the Bumblebee Acres Harry Potter yarn advent calendar, and I get it every single year. And this year I was planning on buying it as usual, and then I was starting to feel like I should have bought it by now. And so I actually went into my credit card statement from last year and looked up when it was that I purchased it, and I realized that the date had passed by a couple weeks. And so I was that guy, and I actually reached out to Bumblebee Acres, and they told me that they are not planning on doing their big themed advent calendars this year. They are planning on doing, I think, some mini sets that you can order, but it's not going to be quite the production that they usually do for their advent calendars. And I am absolutely crushed. I had like 2 or 3 days of just like walking around like, what am I gonna do? I can't not have my Bumblebee Acres advent calendar. But I will, 1, probably buy one of their mini sets that they're going to be doing. And 2, I have been in search of a new advent calendar, which has actually been really fun. All of that to say that I'm trying to save up some money right now so I can spend more money on yarn. Moving right on back to the falling snow socks, though, I'm definitely going to knit them up on this. I think that this Perfect Storm colorway might also be good, but I'm worried about how it might stripe, because this seems like it's going to probably micro stripe based on how it looks in the skein. And I'm just not super sure how that's going to look in this pattern, and I want to have the pattern look its absolute best so that I can take pictures of it, so I can put that with the pattern. And then I might try it with this as well. So I might end up with 2 pairs of the falling snow socks, which honestly is on brand because I love winter so much. So obviously I'm also working on those Christmassy garden socks as well. I've got that half object done, but I'm not gonna talk to you about that again. So the falling snow socks are basically the only thing that I'm really actively working on right now that wasn't previously mentioned. However, I have a little WIPS sub-segment for you today called Frogging. I have a ton of stuff that needs frogging. I have, as any sane knitter would, I think, been putting it off because no one likes to frog their projects. But to motivate me, I have decided that I am going to do a YouTube live stream so that I can frog all of the things that I need to frog. I'm going to go over everything with you guys that I'm going to be frogging in that live stream. But if you would like to join me, if you would like to give me moral support, if you would like to laugh at my pain, then you are more than welcome to join me. I will be streaming at 5 p.m. on May 7th. That is the Friday in between episode releases. There will be wine. There will possibly be manic laughter. There will be a whole lot of knitting talk, and there will be frogging. So again, if you want to come and join me, that's May 7th at 5 p.m. So what am I going to be frogging? First and foremost, of course, is the Schnee cardigan, which I am not even going to bother right now to pull out of this lumpy shape that it's in, because what's the point? Because it's not going to be a cardigan for much longer, or the start of a cardigan. I am honestly going to take these needles out right now because I have been wanting these cords. I've got loads of sweaters that I would like to cast on that I can't cast on because I don't have enough of these long cords. Don't worry, the frogging hasn't started yet. I'm just taking it off the needles. I have most definitely hardcore committed to frogging this because I just don't think that I'm going to like it very much if I wear it in its current state. And I can't start it over again until it's frogged, until I have all of that yarn back, until all of the yarn is separated from where I had to break it and everything. It's best just to get it done and to get it restarted. I want that cardigan, and I can't have it until this is no longer a cardigan and it is once again just balls of yarn. So that's the project that you guys are familiar with. Let me show you my no frill sweater ? Because if you know that pattern at all, and you can see the picture that I put in of it, this is not what a no frills sweater looks like. I mean, first of all, it's not supposed to be a t-shirt. It's not supposed to be a crop top. It is supposed to have mohair in it. This sweater was just such a disaster for me. I really should have stopped trying with this pattern after the second attempt. So the first attempt was a bit more understandable. I knit the whole thing with mohair, and I tried it on, and it was like really heavy. It didn't go down as far as I wanted. The sleeves would have had to be redone. It wasn't actually as like oversized as I had intended to make it, and it just didn't fit me quite right. So I had to pull everything out. Now, because I'm using hand-dyed yarn for this, I was doing helical knitting, regardless of what this pooling tells you. I was doing helical knitting with mohair. If you've ever tried to take out helical knitting, and if you've ever tried to take out mohair, you will understand why I am talking to you in this tone. Because it was the biggest pain in the butt that I have ever done. It was so impossible. I would do just a little bit at a time sometimes, and I would get so frustrated with it that I would give up. I would just give up. Obviously, I got it all out eventually. The problem really, really was the mohair. So I took out both sleeves, saving all the mohair that I could, and then when I got to taking out the body, I just broke the mohair. Whenever it became a problem, I would just rip it right off and put it in the trash, which is a huge waste, and I felt awful doing it because I had spent good money on that mohair, and I do have some of it still. Some of this I just didn't use, like this skein. And then some of it I managed to salvage from ripping it out. And I do intend to use it. I'll use it in maybe a hat or a shawl, something that is not quite so close to my body as a sweater. So this got completely ripped out. It took me months to rip it out. Then it took me months to cast it on again because it was in timeout. I was just super done with this sweater, but I was determined to knit it, partially because I got this yarn from a friend. She dyed it herself. She gave it to me as a gift. And I really wanted to make sure that I used it for something really lovely. She gave me 4 skeins. So what am I going to do with 4 skeins besides something big like a sweater? So several months go by and I'm like, okay, let's do this again. I knit almost all of it. I bound off the bottom. I started on the sleeves. I tried it on. I realized that I wanted it to be longer. And I know you're saying, this looks like a crop top though. I'm getting there. So I unbound it on the bottom. I ripped back all of the ribbing that I'd done on the bottom, and I cast it on again, and I started again, and I realized after I had knit a whole bunch of it that I was knitting it on the wrong needle size. The ribbing is knit in a 1 or 2 needle sizes down from the body of the sweater, and I was knitting it in the ribbing size needles, which looked really funny considering the rest of it was knit on the proper size needles. And then I finally got to the arms. I started doing the arms. I got a good ways down one arm and I realized that I really hated how it felt under my arms. Again, longtime viewers will know that I'm very particular, especially when it comes to things around my underarms. And that is just an anxiety thing for me. And so I was like, okay, what are we going to do? How are we going to make this sweater something that I can actually wear? Well, if the problem is just under my arms, I could just make it a t-shirt. So I did that. I did all of this. There's a little bit of shaping right here, and I just kind of winged it and developed the sleeve on my own. So I finished that and I still didn't really like it, and I was like, well, maybe it's just too heavy. And so I pulled it all out and made it into a crop top. And so now we've got this 75% wool, 25% nylon crop top sweater. I didn't wear it a single time. I was so frustrated with this. I did not wear it at all. I put it in my drawer and I was like, I'm definitely going to wear it when the weather is right for it. At this point, it was already basically summer, so I was like, perfect, a crop top. But it's a wool crop top, and it's not like breezy or breathy or anything, and I never put it on. And more importantly, I probably would have found a time to wear it at some point if it weren't for these raglan sleeves. The key feature on the No Frills sweater is this raglan shaping. It's a top-down sweater. It's supposed to be super easy. That's why it's called No Frills. And so I learned that I do not like raglan shaping. There's something about the way it lays along my shoulder that bothers me. And so I do not knit raglan sweaters any longer. But this has sat in timeout for a really long time because it's already in pieces, just in a million pieces. And so I really don't know what I'm going to do with it. So this is going to be at minimum 2 more balls because I did helical knitting for this. Plus the sleeves, where I picked up on the sleeves and did the sleeves. So we're looking really at a minimum of 4 more little tiny balls of yarn. And that is after 3, how many do I have? That's 5. That one's reasonably sized. 6, 7, 8 breaks already in the yarn. So, or 8 of these little skeins. So, it's just a broken up mess. This used to be 4 skeins of beautiful yarn. It will probably be a shawl at some point. But once this gets ripped out, this yarn is going straight back into timeout because I am still not ready to look at it at the moment. I'm also planning on taking out this stripey, scrappy sweater that is not currently in my knitting room and I can't be asked to go and get. I will put a picture of it somewhere. This was a sweater that I knit entirely by myself just to see if I could do it, really. This was not long after my no frills debacle, and so I was having trouble finding patterns that I thought that I was going to like, and so I decided to just make my own. The sweater in general is really, really lovely, so I might not take out the entire thing. It is just made with acrylic, so I'm not super broken up if I can't save any of the yarn, or if I end up having to get rid of this sweater or anything like that. It was an experiment. It was meant to be an experiment. I might end up taking the whole thing out, or I might end up just deconstructing it a little bit. Basically, the only problem with it is the neck. And that's because I got it into my head as I was knitting up this pattern that all I needed to do for the neck, like the hole for the neck, was to do a bit of shaping here and a bit of shaping on the back. But rather than doing what you typically do for shaping on the back, which is short row shaping, which is to make the back bigger than the front, rather than doing that, I just essentially cut in a little neck hole. And I think I will like it better if I make the neck wider and if I make some shaping in the back rather than just doing some weird decreasing. So that needs to get at least partially deconstructed. That will be one of my tasks. But then the other thing that I have is several pairs of socks. Now, I've talked previously that I went through a phase in my sock knitting where I thought that I was going to knit like knee-high socks, which take 2 skeins of yarn, and so I bought lots of sets of yarn, and I never got around to that. But the reason that I was going to do that is because at the time, that's what I liked in store-bought socks, was I really liked wearing knee-high socks with everything that I was wearing, whether it was leggings or skirts or jeans. I don't wear jeans anymore, but at the time I did. And then there was also a phase that I went through, which made a much more significant dent in my sock knitting, was I thought that maybe the reason I liked store-bought socks but not hand-knit socks was because of the amount of negative ease. So with store-bought socks, they look quite small and they stretch a lot. And so I thought that I just needed to be making my socks smaller. The gist of it is that I made 3 pairs of socks that are, first of all, way too long. That was another thing, was that I thought, oh, well, I really like long socks, so I will just make long socks. But it turns out that, in fact, I very specifically don't like long socks. I like my leg to be exactly 6 inches, which these are significantly longer than that. So that's one reason why I have to take these out. But these are all knit toe up, so if it were just about that, I could just pull back a few inches here and reknit the ribbing. But alas, that is not the only problem, because the bigger problem is that I knit all of these with 56 stitches on size 0 needles. I was knitting for a child. So these, I actually made the pattern myself, and you probably can't tell just by the camera, just because everything gets a little bit washed out, but the patterns in them are very slightly different. So this blue one has a smaller zigzag compared to this red one. And I knit these because I was inspired to knit them by the Super Carlin brothers, who are a YouTube channel that my husband and I follow. They do mostly theory videos on fandoms that I'm in. Disney Princess, Marvel, Harry Potter, Avatar: The Last Airbender. They used to have a segment. They actually got rid of the segment just after I started making these. But they used to have a segment at the end of some of their episodes where they would just show a picture from one of their viewers, and it would be a picture of socks that they owned, and they would just say, "These socks are amazing!" And the way that it was said, it just inspired me to want to make a pattern. So I haven't written this one down at all. I ended up, even though I like the pattern still, it felt weird to call them Carlin Brothers socks. There's not actually anything particularly special about them in relation to the Carlin brothers, besides, like, the colors, because they have a painting in the back of all of their shots from where they're recording that is red and blue. I did actually knit these socks and then show the Carlin brothers. I went to a meet and greet with them back in 2019, I think it was, 2018 or 2019. So here are some very awkward photos of me holding up these socks that I told them were inspired. I'm sorry, this is one of my, like, great mortifications. And anytime I talk with my husband about it or anything, he's like, "Oh, I'm sure it's fine. I'm sure they thought it was really cool." And that may be the case, but for me, this is just so cringy. Because, again, like, these have nothing to do with what the Carlin brothers actually do and what they're all about and everything. So I have no idea what they must have thought when I showed them these. I mean, even when I was doing it, I was kind of uncomfortable with it. I very much subscribe to the don't meet your heroes kind of thing, but for me, it's not because I'm afraid that those people will be not as nice as I like to think them to be, but just because I am so awkward around new people, especially people I admire. And so I just, for 2 years now, I have replayed that meeting in my head, and every time I do it, I cringe. Oh. But getting back on topic, these are too small for me. So I need to pull them out and I need to redo them. And I might end up writing up this pattern, but I will not be calling it anything related to the Super Carlin brothers. I also have these socks that is the same problem. The socks are too small for me. These socks are knit out of Bumblebee Acres yarn. I don't even remember the colorways, but they are definitely some of their Christmas colorways. I don't know if they still dye them. I know that they don't have them right now, even if they do still dye them. I planned on making a pair of these for me, and then also a pair of these for my husband, and I do still intend to do that, but these are not going to fit either of us. And then we've got another pair of Christmas socks. These, fortunately, have not had their afterthought heel put in. I was at least clever enough with these socks to increase them when I got up more in the thigh, because these are some very tall socks. I'm actually really looking forward to reknitting these. These will probably be one of my first cast-ons as soon as I have unknit them. They're this very gorgeous red and green and white micro stripe, and it's a stellina base, so it's got that sparkle in it. I want to own these socks, so I'm really excited to give that another go. But they have to be frogged first. Fortunately, that is the last thing that's in I have everything here in this bag. This is my bag of shame, my frogging bag. But that is it for knitting content. If that's all you're here for, thank you so much for joining me. Please make sure to leave comments, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. And if you are here for the bookish content, stick around. We're on to that next. As usual, we're starting with what I've finished. I will do my best to avoid spoilers, and I will try and let you know beforehand if I am going to spoil something, so that if it's a book that you're interested in, you can skip it. Again, I list all the timestamps in the description down below, and that includes for book discussions. So if there's a book that you don't want anything spoiled for whatsoever, you can skip it and move on to the next one. First book that I'm going to talk to you guys about is The Book of Hygge by Louisa Thomsen Brits. In theory, this book is exactly what I asked for. Because the first book that I read, The Little Book of Hygge, that one was like baby's first Hygge book, I think is the best way to describe it. Just the way that it covers things, it feels like you're talking to someone who has never heard of Hygge before. And, I mean, that's fine. It's a very good, very first Hygge book. The Book of Hygge, I would more likely describe as Hygge for philosophers. So you go from what is practically a children's book to what is very dense literature about Hygge. It was very poetic, the way that it was written. Just to give you an idea of how much it is kind of uppity, I guess, is that every section, not every chapter, multiple times a chapter, there would be quotes. And they would be relevant to what was coming up next, but anytime that a book is full of, like, quotes to introduce the next section always makes me feel like it's a little bit pretentious, and this book was that. That being said, I really liked the approach of this book at the beginning. So the first couple of chapters I was super here for because it made me feel like I was doing Hygge already. It made me feel like I already had an understanding of it and like I just needed to be a little bit more present so that I could recognize those moments and so that I could make sure that I did them more often. The Little Book of Hygge made it feel a little bit more like Hygge is something specifically Danish, and in order to experience it, you need all these things. You actually have to be Danish, and I didn't get that at all from the Book of Hygge. So I did like it for that reason, but it was just a little bit too dense. Fortunately, it was very short. It did just feel like I was reading poetry, which I'm not a fan of poetry. So if that's what you're into, highly recommend this book. Otherwise, maybe skip it. The next book that I want to talk about is Iron Kissed by Patricia Briggs. Before I get into any discussion about this book, I do have to give a trigger warning. The biggest thing, really, that I'm going to be discussing in this review is rape, because that was a very large part of this book. It is very much a spoiler for this book, but it's also very important, and it's what affected me the most in this book. So if that is something that you like to avoid, then absolutely skip this review. I'm going to try and keep calm about this because this book really, really frustrated me, and usually I get very passionate and very upfront about that sort of thing, but I feel like this topic is just a little bit more delicate, and I would really like for my point to come across without frustration and anger. So the biggest problem with this book is the fact that the main character is raped. The reason that I hate that so much is because, first of all, I avoid books that have rape in them very intentionally. It is a topic that I'm sure nobody is comfortable with, but in particular, I find it very difficult and it upsets my anxiety. It upsets just my brain in general. I get very upset when I have to read anything about it, and so I avoid it. Especially when I'm reading for entertainment, because no matter how it relates to the plot, I only find it traumatic and I don't find it useful. And that is probably part of the problem. There might be some people who have read this book and the rape felt very topical or it made sense in the context of the books for them, but for me, it just felt incredibly unnecessary. And I think that's really the sticking point. The fact that this book ended with a rape just completely ruined the rest of the book for me. It, first of all, completely came out of nowhere. I was so shocked that this happened to the main character that I just felt like I was watching a train wreck. I couldn't believe it. And at least to me, it didn't feel necessary. I can see kind of where the author might have thought this was a good idea to put in her book for two reasons. The first is that there is this idea in writing that when you get to a point where you are stuck, or if you aren't sure really where to send your plot next, you think of what is the worst possible thing that could happen to my characters right now, and that's what you write. Typically, when you talk in writing circles about that, it means like you throw a massive challenge at your characters, or you kill off one of your characters, or something like that. But I can understand why Patricia Briggs thought that this rape scene was appropriate, because the character, obviously she does it completely against her will, but she is being mind controlled into doing this. And I would say that when it comes to what does Mercy Thomsen fear the most in the world, it is being controlled. So she was being controlled, and she was, and this is spoilers for this book, but she was being mind controlled. She was told that she was going to have sex with this person and she was going to like it, and that she would be ruined for all others for the rest of her life because no one was ever going to love her after this. And because she was under mind control, she believed it. Every word of that, she believed it. And it was so heartbreaking, and I really was so uncomfortable with the whole thing. I absolutely hated it. I have been tempted to give this series up on numerous occasions, and I am definitely near to my breaking point with it. If it had been any worse, I definitely wouldn't be reading the next one. I wouldn't have even finished this one. As it was, I was glad that I read the ending because it felt like the rape was not being completely dismissed, but also like the main character was going to be able to get through it. I am giving this series one more chance. I'm going to read the next one, and then if I still don't like it, if it's still too dark, I will just jump into the Alpha and Omega series and screw the context. Obviously, I am aware that it doesn't actually matter if I read this whole series or not. The author could not care less, but I care. I want to give it one more chance. I want to see if one more book will do it, or if it will really just kill the whole series for me. I find it unlikely that there will be another rape scene, so at least that's good. Oh, and you guys remember that I was complaining so much about the love triangle in the previous books? Yeah, that was resolved in this book, and I don't even care. That's how much that rape scene bothered me. The next book on my list is Blame It on Scotland by Patience Griffin. This is the 7th book in a series, and the rest of the series is very fluffy, very sweet, but I have to give a trigger warning with this book as well because there is, again, rape and abortion this time. I will say that the rape scene is very, very brief, especially in comparison to the previous book. It is more of a mention and less of a plot point. The abortion, on the other hand, is a massive plot point throughout the whole series, so that gets mentioned a lot, and it will be mentioned a lot in this review. Despite those trigger warnings, this is actually still a very light book. Not, obviously, if you're triggered by talk of abortion, but it is still a romance. It is still a very fluffy read. It's part of a series called Kilts and Quilts, so it's quite silly. The whole series, in general, is very much like fantasy fulfillment. It seems like the author is not from Scotland, but all of these books take place in Scotland. They're in this very idyllic city, town, village. There we go. They're in this very idyllic village of Gandygow, or the neighboring village, which is Wussendale. And every book focuses on one member from the village and then a newcomer to the village who is usually American. So it definitely always feels just kind of sweet and silly and fluffy. And so the fact that this book tries to tackle abortion felt really out of place. It's not to say that no difficult topics are ever discussed in romance novels. That's absolutely not true. But I just didn't feel like this book handled it very well. And let me explain why. It feels like the book is trying to say something about abortion, but I'm not sure what that is that it's trying to say. Because there are two characters in the book that have gotten an abortion. One is our main character, our main female protagonist, and then the other is an ex-girlfriend of the main male protagonist, Tuck. And Tuck is very bitter towards his ex who got this abortion. He's not necessarily bitter because of the abortion. He's bitter because she was pregnant with another man's child, and he was going to marry her, and he didn't have any idea that it was someone else's child or anything like that. They were 17, and she had been cheating on him, and that's how she got pregnant. And so it's very clear that we're not supposed to like this character, but are we not supposed to like her partially because she got an abortion? Because the main character got an abortion because she was 15 and she was raped. The book is very clearly saying by the end that it's okay that Wynne got an abortion, our main female protagonist. It's okay that she did. And it feels kind of like they're saying it's not okay that the other character did. It's unclear if she is unlikable because she lied and she cheated, or if she's unlikable because she lied and she cheated and she had an abortion. And so I really just do not know what this book was trying to say about that topic. I will also say that it is a little bit of a miracle that I got through this book, because I was so annoyed with both of the main characters, but particularly the lead female character, through the entire thing. It was really only the happily ever after that saved this book. The last hour or so of this book was really what made it, I think, a 3 or 4 stars rather than a 2 or 3 stars book for me. So at least it had a strong ending, but I was so annoyed with Wynne because she was just constantly back and forth and back and forth. And it wasn't even whether or not she liked Tuck, it was whether or not she should sleep with him. In particular, one of the character quirks of Wynne that I found the most annoying is that, and I should have counted the amount of times that she did this. It would have just been to help me get through it, really. The amount of times she called herself a hussy or something equivalent. And let me be clear, I don't think that the book was slut-shaming. In general, those books tend to be pretty, like, pro-sex, which is a little bit surprising, which just made it that much weirder that she kept calling herself all these names because she was attracted to Tuck. And like, I genuinely just did not understand what her character was supposed to be. After reading this book, I'm actually a little bit confused as to why I liked this series in the first place. I know that they're all just as cheesy as this one, maybe with a little bit less of the weird constant back and forth. But I read this series, this Kilts and Quilts series, about 2 years ago now. And so I liked it enough that I now own all of the books. So I think I'm going to go back and reread this series and see if I still like it or if it is just all ridiculous as this last book was. Last on my list of finished books is Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. Oh my god, guys, I loved this book! I loved it so much. I loved it so much more than I thought I was going to. I love it more than I thought. I love it more than I remember, because I have read this book before, and for some reason, maybe it was because I read a physical version rather than having it narrated for me, but I found, at least at some point, that it dragged, and so I didn't enjoy it because I thought it was slow at some point. But this read-through, I loved every moment. I just loved every moment. I have heard criticisms of this book that the plot and the ending is a little bit overcomplicated, that the romance at the end kind of comes out of nowhere, but I didn't agree with that. I thought that if you read the whole book, the plot makes complete sense. It doesn't necessarily come out easily if you're trying to explain what happens in the book, but it all makes sense while you're reading it. And I felt like the romance was gorgeously subtle. I thought that Diana Wynne Jones did a really good job of just kind of weaving in little moments that if you don't realize that you're falling in love, you wouldn't recognize. But because I already know how it ends because I've read the book and because I've seen the movie, the fact that there were little hints at the romance throughout, I absolutely loved. One of the other things that I really loved about the book is a bit of a spoiler, so you will want to skip to the next book if you don't want any spoilers for Howl's Moving Castle, because this is something that is very different from the movie. So if you don't want spoilers, go on and skip this. The fact that Howl is from Wales was brilliant. This is again one of those things that I've heard was kind of weird and just fell out of place, but I thought it was brilliant because it is kind of glossed over in the book because the whole book is from Sophie's perspective. And to Sophie, Howl is magic already. Magic, she already knows that magic exists. And so the fact that there's just this other world that is just a little bit weird, it's like, well, that's magic for you. But for us, for the reader, it's so cool because it becomes clear then that Howl is a human, he's from Earth, he's from our world, and he learned magic, and he went to this other world where he became a wizard, and to me, it just made the book feel all that much more magical. And it was, I thought, a beautiful touch. And definitely the best thing about it was, again, that it was from Sophie's perspective, so she doesn't understand why it's so significant that he's from Wales, but the reader does. And it's not something that Sophie could ever put into context, or you could ever put into context for Sophie, but it is just such a fun detail. But that is it for what I have finished. Moving on now to what I am currently reading. First thing on this list is A Cuban Girl's Guide to Tea and Tomorrow by Laura Taylor Namey. This book has been on my to-read list for ages, and so I finally just got it on audiobook and I have started listening to it, and so far, I don't love it. I just find the main character, Lena, a little bit annoying. Well, less annoying and more that I just cannot connect with her. So what is happening in this book is that Lena is from Miami. She's gone through a ton of heartbreak recently, and so the cure that her mom comes up with is to send her to England to spend the summer with her aunt. And Lena is so annoyed about this. Let's break this down because, first of all, Miami, and I'm sorry to anyone who lives in Florida, Miami seems miserable to me. I am from Michigan. My favorite season is winter. I would not do well in Miami. So she's in England. She doesn't want to be in England. This is incomprehensible to me. She's 18 years old and she is miserable that she has been sent to England? What is wrong with you? I am so unsympathetic because of this, and that is very much a me thing. There are plenty of people, I'm sure, who would not like to go to England, but I cannot fathom it. And so the fact that she's complaining about being in England makes me just dislike her. Something that is not related to the character, but is more about the author, is that the author keeps constantly talking about how cold it is in England. It's June. Like, England can get cold, but I have been in England in May, and it was fine. Like, I'm not going to be in flip-flops and a tank top necessarily, but I'm not going to be absolutely miserable in those clothes either, I don't think. The author is treating it very much like she's in England in like spring or fall, and it's not. It's June. It gets hot in England too. Like, it's not Miami temperatures, of course, but it's not like absolutely miserable cold either. So that's been bothering me. I'm also really finding the character annoying because she is so full of herself. She feels very self-centered. She feels quite conceited. I'm really, really hoping for some character growth. I'm hoping that that is going to be one of the main arcs of the book. Let me give you an example of what I mean so you don't think that I'm just being, a fuddy-duddy old 26-year-old. So when Lena comes to England, she is staying in this bed and breakfast that her aunt runs, and Lena loves, loves, loves to cook. She's going to be taking over her grandmother's bakery when she returns back to Miami. So while she's at the bed and breakfast, she wants to keep baking. And she goes into the kitchen, and the lead baker there is Polly, and she thinks Polly is too full of herself. She thinks that she shouldn't have to prove herself, even though it's Polly's kitchen. Not only that, but she looks down on Polly's baking. Lena gets all of her recipes from her grandmother. And so, because she has all these recipes and because she has been baking for so long, she feels that she knows baking better than this adult Polly, who has been baking for way longer. She thinks that Polly puts too much sugar in the things that she bakes. And she knows this based on the fact that she follows her grandmother's recipes. And Polly, as it turns out, follows her grandmother's recipes as well. And Lena's response to this is not to think, oh, interesting, there's two ways of doing things. It's oh, well, Polly was raised with an unrefined palate, and that's why she doesn't know better than to put all this sugar in things. How dare you? How dare you? First of all, you are a child. I don't care if you're 18, you are a child. And second of all, that is so condescending. It is so condescending, and I hate condescension above all. That is one of my top tier bad personality traits. I do not like people who are condescending. You can be smarter than everyone in the room, and you can know it as long as you do not patronize people about it. And I find Lena patronizing, and I do not like it. But I am only a little ways into the book, so hopefully things will get better. Moving on to what else I'm reading, I have decided to start the Night Huntress series over again. I was talking about it so much when I was talking about all those Patricia Briggs books, and so I just decided that I'm going to reread it. I have read the entire Night Huntress series before, but I have not read everything in order, including all of the standalone books and the separate series. The Night Huntress series itself, I think, is about 7 books, but there are 2 standalone books and then at least 2 other series. The 2 other series are happening a little bit during the Night Huntress series, but mostly after. But there are also a few novellas that I've never read, or short stories, and so I'm hoping to sprinkle those in the correct order as well. And so I'm just really excited to reread this whole series. I already have, I think, like the first 4 or 5 books checked out on my audiobook app. I just have to make time to read them now. And finally, the last book on my list I always have to read from my notes because I can never remember how to say the title. It's Mrs. Perivale and the Blue Fire Crystal by Hoffman. I have managed to read a little bit more of this book, and the more I read it, the more it feels like a children's book, a badly written children's book. I have read really good children's fiction, and I would not classify this as that. Also, I would not think it was children's fiction at all. I don't think that based on the premise of it that it would be marketed towards kids. And so the fact that it is written in the way that it is very strange. In particular, the dialogue feels weird, but the plot as well is very weak, I want to say. I just recently got through the bit where they were explaining why she needed to go on the quest, and it was so basic. It was basically just, something has been stolen, and only the chosen one can get it back, which is so basic. There are definitely ways to make that more interesting that they did not do in this book. And then there's a little thing, which is the accents of the little creatures. So there are creatures in this book called Inklings, and they're what spur on this quest in the first place. But they speak in this weird accent. Let me pull it up. Here's a really good example. I'm going to try and read it verbatim as best as I can. No, I cannot tell you what the prophecy is. It's an Mari language. No translation. Chippa told you as best we can. I, first of all, hate it when accents are written out anyway. I find it really pulls me out of the story. This one in particular, I do not know what the accent is supposed to be. I do understand that you can't always pin down an accent, but if you're going to write it out like this, I need to have at least some idea, because otherwise it just looks really broken, and it's really, really, really frustrating to read. So I might not finish this one, actually, which I know it's a huge departure for me, but I have just read too many Kindle books lately that have been so hard to get through. I'm going to give it another couple of chapters because I'm really just about to get into where things are actually starting to happen, and hopefully that will make it at least a little bit better, but we will see. But that is everything for this video, guys, so please like the video, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment down below, all that good stuff. And just a reminder that the link for my new pattern, which is being released today, is in the description down below, along with the discount code for that pattern. Another reminder, I will see you guys in 1 week at 5 p.m. for that live stream where I will be frogging all the things. I hope to see you guys there. And if not, I will see you guys in 2 weeks.